This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at numberfire.com, and this is episode 585 of the Late Round Podcast, with many shows that are part of the FanDuel Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. Before we get into the trends this week, I want to let you know that FanDuel is partnering with EA Sports to bring you this week's NFL Sunday Million contest. Enter the NFL Sunday Million Marquee Contest presented by EA Sports Madden NFL 22 this weekend and compete for your chance at a share of the $1.5 million prize pool. Simply build your best 9-player roster while staying under the salary cap and follow along as the games unfold. With 10 games scheduled for Sunday afternoon, there's plenty of big names to choose from and plenty of opportunity for a big payday. Kickoff is right around the corner, so head to FanDuel.com and get in the game today. For more details, visit FanDuel.com or download the FanDuel Fantasy app. Eligibility restrictions apply. Over the last couple of weeks, I've talked about the Eagles' defense. Whether it was on the matchup show or yesterday's 15 transaction show, the Eagles have been really good against wide receivers in fantasy football, and they've been really bad against tight ends. And when you look deeper into that data, it makes sense. So far this season, wide receiver groups against Philadelphia have seen their target share drop on average by over 6 percentage points. So when they face the Eagles as a team, their wide receivers see their target share drop by over 6 percentage points. The Eagles have been the best matchup for tight ends in adjusted fantasy points allowed this year. And that's reflected in adjusted target share allowed. While the Eagles rank 32nd in adjusted wide receiver target share allowed, they're third in adjusted tight end target share allowed. So teams are attacking the Eagles in a very specific way. And that volume is what's driving the results in fantasy football, which is what we typically see with volume. David Montgomery has now been back from injury for 2 games, a Week 9 contest against Pittsburgh and then this past week against Baltimore. In those 2 games, he's played 109 snaps. His backup, Khalil Herbert, has played 17. Montgomery hasn't put up a monster game yet. And his target shares in these contests, they haven't been great. They've been 7% and 3%. But he's still running plenty of routes, and he's dominating the backfield rushes. He saw 93% of the team's running back rushes in Week 11. I considered making Montgomery a buy candidate on this week's 15 transactions episode. That tells you how I'm feeling about him right now. Very early in the season, right when I saw Austin Ekeler get goal line work, I immediately made him a buy candidate. Because that's what he really needed in order to become an elite fantasy football running back. He needed that goal line work. So get this, Ekeler currently has 8 rushes from within his opponent's 5-yard line this year. His career high in a single season is 9 goal line rushes. He has 5 goal line rushing touchdowns when his career high is 3. And if you look at his touches from within the 10, it's even more glaring. He has 17 rush attempts from within the 10-yard line this year. His career high is 11. This is why he's now an elite RB1. It was the biggest question mark for Ekeler entering the season, and it hit. He's a beast. On Monday night against the Buccaneers, yes, the Giants' offense, the whole team, they looked terrible. And while Kadarius Toney didn't get you a ton of fantasy points, there were some good signs. Number 1, the man is a human joystick. He's one of the shiftiest players that I've ever seen. But number 2, he saw 1/3 of the Giants' targets. Kenny Golladay and Darius Slayton ran more routes, but the target share is encouraging because he hasn't hit that high of a share since that Week 5 explosion against Dallas. Now, I still don't know what things will look like when Sterling Shepard is back and healthy. Toney played the majority of his snaps from the slot according to Pro Football Focus against the Bucs, when Shepard's played 72.5% of his snaps from the slot this year. We do have a small sample of Shepard and Toney together this season, and Shepard was the one who got to the slot more often. But we haven't seen them at full strength with Kenny Golladay. So it's going to be interesting to see how this all shakes out. There's still a possibility that the Giants aren't smart and they just underutilize Toney, but he's at least worth a hold. Trend 5 has to do with the Buffalo Bills backfield. It's currently a disaster for fantasy football. In each of their last 2 games, Matt Breida has scored the most PPR points. And this past week, Breida ended up seeing the most rushes on the ground with 5. That accounted for 45.5% of the team's running back rushes. Maybe some of this is game script driven, but it's still really alarming. It was already bad enough that we had a split backfield between 2 guys, but now it's become a 3-headed backfield. You can't trust anyone there right now. And in deeper formats, you could consider adding Breida. Christian McCaffrey is back to having elite usage. He's now been back from his injury for 3 games. One of those games came against New England, where he had a 78% running back rush share and a 17% target share. Those are really good numbers, but they're not necessarily Christian McCaffrey-like numbers. Things have gotten better over the last 2 weeks. In week 10 against Arizona, CMC's target share was over 31%. He didn't have a super high rush share, but part of that was likely game script driven, at least part of it. This past week in a closer game, we saw that elite usage once again. He saw 91% of Carolina's running back rushes, and he had a 30% target share. He's now been a top 4 weekly running back in PPR formats in 4 of his 6 games played this year. And that includes the game where he was injured and had to exit early against the Texans. He's a fantasy football cheat code. We knew Ja'Marr Chase wasn't going to maintain his early season pace. It was just too hard for any human being to do that. Now, over the last 3 weeks, he's ranked as the wide receiver 26, 39, and 28. Is it time to panic? I don't think so. Chase has a target share per game of 26.5% over his last 3. That's actually higher than what he'd seen over his previous 7. He just hasn't given us the big plays that we were seeing earlier in the season. Those will come. When looking at my adjusted fantasy points allowed numbers, the team with the easiest running back schedule so far this year has been Pittsburgh. Which is interesting and not that surprising, because if you listen to the 15 transaction show yesterday, the Steelers have had the toughest wide receiver schedule in terms of adjusted fantasy points allowed. Moving forward, so from weeks 12 through 17, the Steelers don't have the toughest running back schedule in the league, but it's one of the toughest. The hardest goes to the Raiders, then the Bills, then the Patriots, Bengals, Packers, and Jets, and then the Steelers. So I wouldn't stress having Najee Harris as a result. Volume drives fantasy football. This is just a small piece of the puzzle, but it's at least something to think about. I didn't mention Laviska Shenault on yesterday's 15 transaction show because his percent roster number was right on the fringe of being an actual waiver wire ad. So I'll just talk about him here. With Jamal Agnew on IR, Shenault has a little bit more intrigue. In week 11, he played half of his snaps from the slot. That was the first time that he'd seen that since DJ Chark's injury. And those numbers are courtesy of Pro Football Focus. Agnew was playing that role and he had been seeing decent volume from there. Shenault should be in that role, and he could end up seeing an uptick in volume as a result of the injury. There's a chance they do something like roll Tavon Austin out a bit, but it makes sense to at least get Shenault and see if his usage changes. He's seen target shares of 23% and 21% over his last 2 games after back-to-back games of just 4 targets. Now, stemming from that Shenault trend, with this last trend, let's talk about Trevor Lawrence. He hasn't thrown multiple touchdowns in a game since week 1. Over his last 7, he's totaled 3 touchdown passes. It's been rough out there. Now, Jacksonville does have a pass-to-rush touchdown ratio of just 0.8, meaning they've run for more touchdowns than they've thrown for this year. And based on their pass rate, and just based on how teams generally score their touchdowns, that number probably should be a little bit higher. The problem is that the Jags have only scored 18 offensive touchdowns this year. It's just a bad offense. So even if regression hits, it's not going to catapult Lawrence into any sort of usable conversation. Those numbers might be beneficial for the pass catchers like Laviska Shenault, but it's a really tough situation for that passing attack right now. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet subscribed to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Thanks for listening, everyone. I got the Sleeper Show tomorrow. I'll talk to you then.